In the north of France, not far off the Arras-Cambrai road, is the small village of Monchy-le-Preux. At the eastern edge of that small village, sitting atop an old enemy strongpoint, is the mighty Caribou Monument, dedicated to the men of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. Men who fought and died here during World War I. It gallantly faces in the direction of the enemy. And now, some 96 years later, this truly incredible story of determination and valour can be told. On the 1st of July, 1916, 801 men of the Newfoundland Regiment went over the top at the Battle of the Somme. The next day only 68 were able to answer roll call. A little over 3 months later, October 12, 1916, the regiment was once again in the fray at the Battle of Goudecourt. Casualties were massive, but the Newfoundlanders were one of the few units on the British front to capture and hold their objective that day, but at a terrible cost.
I'm Major Michael Pretty. I am OC of Bravo Company in the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. I'm also the Domestic Operations Liaison Officer to the Provincial Government of Newfoundland and Labrador. I became the Chief Planning Officer for the pilgrimage in 2006. And that was the first time the Royal Newfoundland Regiment went back to France and Flanders as a regiment since it fought there in the Great War. I found out that I had relatives that fought and died over there. Some were missing. They never found them. You don't really understand what those young men did so far away until you go there. And I just had this promise that I made to them at that time that I would do everything I possibly could to make sure that their deeds and sacrifices were remembered. Private John Pretty was killed and went missing at the Battle of Monchy in April 1917. Regimental number 2276, I believe it was.
My name is Ken Gatehouse. I'm the Executive Director of the Royal Canadian Legion in Newfoundland. I'm also a serving officer with a reserve signal unit here in St. John's. Retired from the regular military a couple of years ago after 32 years of service. I'm the grandson of Sergeant Charlie Parsons, who was the Regimental Signal Sergeant, Regimental number 783.
I'm Major Michael Bennett. I'm currently the Operations Officer for 1st Battalion of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, and my previous experience includes 3 operational deployments to Cyprus in 91-92, Croatia in 1993, and Afghanistan in 2007 and 8. My great uncle was Regimental number 770, Private Peter Francis Bennett, who was missing in action on the 14th of April 1917 at the Battle of Monchy.
Well, the part that I'm most qualified to speak about of the men who saved Monchy is Kevin Keegan, because we have Kevin Keegan's letters here as one of our archives collections, and it includes the letter that Kevin Keegan wrote to his mother and father the day after, on the 18th of April 1917. And it demonstrates a number of things. I think it shows Kevin Keegan's the quality of his education, but it also shows his ability to capture that whole thing and put it into a perspective that his parents would understand. There's a certain amount of seriousness about the letter. There's also a certain amount of wry humor.
Some would have thought the regiment had a rest coming their way, but this was not to be the case. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig's spring offensive had just days before captured Vimy Ridge and the town of Monchy. And now the Newfoundlanders, as part of the 88th Brigade, were tasked at taking the high ground east of Monchy as part of Operational Order Number 66.
Their objectives kind of make sense, right? Because they got the orders, they interpreted the orders and made their plan, which is laid out in the war diary.
The 88th Brigade was to take the enemy's front line, Shrapnel Trench, and capture the high ground of Infantry Hill. This two-battalion attack would be carried out by the 1st Essex Regiment on the left flank, and then the Newfoundland Regiment on the right. The premise was simple. At 0 hour, under the protection of a creeping barrage, C and D would attack. Once on their way, D Company would advance east from the assembly trench to a small wood near Infantry Hill, while C Company would move towards Bois du Vert. B Company would serve as the moppers-up, advancing behind the first wave, occupying the first empty German trench until the first wave captured the next one. Meanwhile, A Company was given the important responsibility of securing the right flank, the regiment's only protection on the right, while they advanced into enemy territory. While the 1st Essex Regiment was given that task on the left flank during their advance. But in war, plans change, and sometimes those changes come at the last minute.
It was clearly evident that the divisional commander wanted the high ground, which was Infantry Hill, because it dominated Monchy. And in behind the high ground, or what we call dead ground in the military even today, is a good forming up place for counterattacks. The order was C and D Company up front, A Company to the south in the strong point, B Company in the back, and then the intelligence officer had snipers and other people that they had certain jobs. So their plan was to push out, take a certain amount of space up front, capture part of Infantry Hill, machine gun woods, secure that, and as they secured the ground, to push other companies forward to their objectives, and then push scouts out to reconnoiter beyond what they've taken to see what the Germans were up to back then.
With these new orders, D Company on the left was to still capture the wood on the south side of Infantry Hill, while C Company would create a strong point east of Infantry Hill towards Bois du Vert. However, they would have to now hold the two strong points with only 2 platoons, as the rest of the company, along with the regimental scouts, were to push forward and establish 2 more strong points to dominate the dead ground east of Bois du Vert. And so it was that all 4 companies of the Newfoundland Regiment would be part of the assault. One of those was D Company.
After Beaumont Hamel, they spent days recovering first the soldiers they could find alive, crawling out at night, looking for them and dragging them back, and then later recovering the bodies.
They were very sturdy, so they'd seen action at Gallipoli, they'd seen the other actions at Beaumont Hamel. My great uncle, he'd been wounded. These guys knew what the drill was. They weren't worried about, oh my gosh, am I going to get killed today? It was, oh well, I'm either going to get a Victoria Cross or a Wooden Cross, so let's get going. They were, sturdy fellow. They were, at the time of the Battle of Monchy, these guys would have seen a fair bit of action. And even at post Beaumont Hamel, they had done very intensive training with all hands. So, when they did the attack, they were ready to go for that attack. However, they didn't realize that they were facing such a marked, substantial enemy. But then they held their ground. When they got to where they were going, they stayed there until they ran out of ammo and were captured.
The other company that was to make the assault was C Company. These men would now be one of the first to go into action on 14 April.
Dearest Mother and Dad, I should and would have written before, but I've been so busy I haven't had time to look around. Well, by now, you probably know everything, but there's probably a few things you'd like to hear, so here goes. Well, we marched up to the line in great style. I'll never forget the last 6 miles. We told the men that we'd be going over the top in the morning, and as I saw them swinging along down the road, fully equipped for the show, I couldn't help thinking how proud you'd feel of them. If you could have seen the whole regiment singing their way to the line, everybody as keen as mustard, hoping that the morrow would bring success. We got to the line, took over and started to plan out the stunt. And I must say, the CO, as usual, worked like a Trojan. Nothing was too much trouble for him. He explained things minutely, and in the morning found everyone ready for the work, with me to my sorrow, more or less out of it, attached to headquarters.
On the morning of 14 April, 0 hour approaches, and the Newfoundlanders wait in their jumping-off trenches. The mood is calm. No one could foresee what was about to happen in just 30 minutes' time, especially the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Forbes Robertson, as he made his final rounds before the battle began. And with that, 611 men of the Newfoundland Regiment climbed up and out of their trenches, once more into the unknown. D Company was met with withering machine gun fire, artillery bombardment and mortar rounds.
What happened was that the Boche had planned his big attack to recapture the village that we were in front of, as it meant everything to him. He had massed 2 divisions ready to attack, but ours came off before his. And when the barrage opened, our fellows were out and away like a streak, treading on the heels of the barrage. They got to their objective and started digging in, when, as far as can be learned, the Huns came on in their thousands, and our fellows didn't have a ghost of a chance. Oh, some few were able to retire. Others, the greater number of them, died fighting gloriously. Some others must have been taken prisoners. We do not know, but that is what we hope.
The men of C Company were faring no better. The Germans had answered the British artillery fire with that of their own, with devastating results.
When the guys went forward, and there's been a number of reports that they went forward, they were getting cut to pieces, and they never left their... They could have withdrawn. They were lost. When the mopping up crew from B Company was going forward to C Company, he left with nearly a platoon of guys and got to linked up with C Company with only 2 men left, and got wounded himself before he went back to B Company.
The enemy artillery and machine gun fire accounted for many dead and wounded Newfoundlanders. Many were never to be seen again, listed later as missing in action. On the other side of the Newfoundlander advance, the men of the 23rd Bavarian Regiment were well dug in and holding their position. There were explanations as to why the German commander General Ludendorff was so prepared for the attack by the Newfoundlanders and the Essex. It could have been just bad timing on the British's part, as the Germans may have been massing for their own offensive. However, some say that they had put into effect a new tactic called the elastic defense.
At this time, the German army were starting to have become short on people. They had adopted this thing called elastic defense, which is basically lightly defended up front. If you're attacked, let the attack be absorbed, and then counterattack.
In an elastic defense, the German front lines were manned by only 1 battalion from each regiment, keeping the bulk of their forces behind. Under attack, the front line would hold firm at some points and yield at others, thus denying the enemy the advantage of a uniform rate of advance with constant artillery support. With the Germans keeping the bulk of their force well back, the main battle would follow as they launched counter-attacks of their own choice, well out of view from the British artillery. If it was the elastic defence, the Newfoundlanders were permitted to occupy the German forward trenches in front of Infantry Hill. Regardless of what tactic the Germans were employing, as the Royal Newfoundland Regiment advanced towards the high ground of Infantry Hill, they were subjected to a strong German counterattack. And although both C and D companies achieved their initial objectives, both the Newfoundlanders and the 1st Essex now found themselves surrounded, and therefore unable to push on to their second objectives. And so, just mere hours after the battle had started, this German counterattack, from 3 sides, had devastating results. Forbes Robertson was a professional British Army officer and the acting commanding officer of the Newfoundlanders. He was the type of officer that most likely hated having to go back, away from the line. Forbes Robertson always felt his place was at the front, leading his men.
He was one of the unique ones. Led from the front, worked hard, loved the troops, loved the regiment, thought highly of them. He, as a young officer, had won shooting competitions, and there's even one trophy he won in 1909 about a lancing in 10 pegs, which is the horse on a lance, and you run through it and you grab the 10 pegs on it. He won that competition.
You know, some of the officers have a reputation for directing from behind, and Forbes Robertson was one who had a reputation for directing from in front.
Keegan described him as a Trojan when he worked, and he explained his plan, and he made sure everybody knew it. Highly respected by the men.
Forbes Robertson's place was at the battalion HQ, now situated near the centre of the village of Monchy. However, he was not the only one whose place was at the headquarters that morning. St. John's native J.H. Hiller was an orderly room corporal. Private Japheth Hounsell was a signaller from Wesleyville. Private Albert Rose from St. Barb was the battalion runner. Provost Sergeant J.R. Waterfield and Provost Corporal Walter Pitcher were military policemen. Private Charlie Parsons and Private Fred Curran, both from St. John's, were attached to the headquarters as signallers.
A small man in stature, only 5'2", but yeah, he was a fairly fit, tough guy. So yeah, we had a close relationship, and I guess like most kids, I was very inquisitive. Was interested in what he had done. There was the picture of the Monchy 9 was on the wall in his house, so I asked questions, and I learned a lot and knew a lot, I guess, for a 10-year-old kid.
Lieutenant Kevin Keegan from St. John's was a signals officer with the regiment, who in mere hours would be faced with impossible odds.
He was expected to follow in his father's footsteps and become a medical doctor. He gave it up and came back and joined the Newfoundland Regiment.
His letters, and I've only read the one, is the most accurate description of what the regiment went through in the First World War.
It's very interesting because many soldiers' letters at those times were published in the local papers. It was a way of keeping their spirit, their memory alive. Because remember that St. John's was a small town. So everybody knew everybody. And so these letters would have been published. But this particular letter, he had written on the bottom of it, not to be published. So he says some things in that letter that were meant only for his parents.
Back at battalion headquarters, the scene was chaotic. No information was coming in from the front, and the runners sent to find out what was going on were falling victim to German machine gun and artillery fire, and only unconfirmed accounts of the battle reached Forbes Robertson and his staff through shocked and dazed survivors.
From what I can piece together from the wounded stragglers coming in, sir, is that the situation at front is very sideways. The information from that Essex man can be confirmed. No one think for sure. The enemy is advancing. But from where and how many we have no idea.
We need to know what is going on up there. Keegan! Sir! Right, Keegan. I need to know if the enemy is indeed advancing and the strength and direction. From what Captain Rader just told me, the ideal vantage point for you to get a good look is the assembly trench. Yes, right here. Where D Company jumped off this morning. Right. I'll see you back here in 20 minutes. Good luck. Yes, sir.
The Boche started for the village, and the CO sent me down to find out something. I met a few wounded, saw the Hun on the skyline, reported to the CO, and got a few headquarters together.
What Keegan was about to find out would once again have a lasting effect on not only the regiment, but Newfoundland as well. In just under 4 hours, the Newfoundland Regiment was once again facing decimation. Facing overwhelming enemy strength, the men that were not killed or wounded had been forced to surrender. It would seem that all was lost, and the important strong point that was the village of Monchy was once again about to fall back into German hands. Before he could report on the situation up front, Keegan had to get there first. The area he had to cross was under intense German artillery and mortar fire. Lieutenant Keegan had to dodge both that and enemy machine gun fire in order to get to the Newfoundlanders' jumping-off trench. In order to make it to the jumping-off trench, Keegan had to keep moving. First through the twisted destruction of the village, still under intense enemy shell fire, and then onto the open ground of the battlefield.
Artillery never hits the same place twice, right? So one of the things that soldiers sometimes may have done is if you see a shell land, you run over to that place and you're zigzagging through the town where artillery rounds had just landed, hoping they would keep you safe. What he did and how he got back and forth through that town, nobody will ever know. It's not in his letters, there's no accounts of it. I do know that he went out 2 or 3 times to get information and brought it back, and then went out with the rush with everybody and somehow survived that.
It's when he made it to the jumping-off trench that the situation became clear.
It was reported back that there were no unwounded men between headquarters and the German lines, everybody would have heard that. And the sensible thing to do would be, well, there's a big giant German army about to bear down on us, and we have no troops to stop them. We should go. And that wasn't the thought.
Any luck reaching the gate headquarters?
No, sir. The lines have definitely been cut.
Keegan, what's the situation?
Grave, sir. There's not a man out there that's not dead or wounded.
What about D Company?
That is both D and C Company, sir. And no one's heard from A Company either. I also observed about 200 to 300 Germans advancing across the front. Now, they've already cleared the first objective. There's nothing between them and the village.
Right, Keegan. We'll have to create a little diversion for a quarter of an hour, son.
Yes, sir.
Right. Sergeant Major White! Sir! Collect headquarters! Captain ready. Sir. Make your way to brigade headquarters and inform them about our situation. Tell them we need reinforcements immediately. Good luck.
Let's go, lads! Get all the ammo that you can. We'll get the rest off the dead and wounded. Get to it, lads! Come on, let's go!
Problem with the phones, of course, is with all the constant shelling, your phone lines get cut. So the signalers all became runners. So these were, small, wiry guys who they were all fit. They needed to be able to move, but they were, intelligent, clever fellows who were there. So I don't think my great uncle would have cut it in headquarters for very long. But so these were, guys able to read and write, able to understand direction, able to function independently without having to have supervision, because you had to be able to say, take this message, bring it to the colonel, find him no matter what. And they would have to get up and move and, function and think independently. That's the kind of people who were there. As well as you had your provost, your military police guys who were part of that headquarters element. So these would have been, literally your clerks and your cooks and your, some police guys, not your frontline infantry, bayonets fixed, advancing toward the enemy. And they didn't flinch again when that, Forbes Robertson said, "Let's go."
But they knew that they had a job to do, because behind there were wounded. There would have been a huge gap in the line. So they kind of dug in and said, "This is it. We don't go back."
You remember I always said that Forbes was one of the best? And he had certainly proved it this time. He said, well, it's up to us to provide a little diversion, Keegan. And taking his rifle, he started off. They were giving the village hell by this time, and as we trekked along towards the spot I'd been observing from, we lost a couple of our little band through shell fire.
The first time that you see shrapnel coming down, you find yourself under fire and you get the big rush and the eyes go wide and everybody's in a bit of a panic. As that progresses, it almost becomes normal. To an extent, so you get to deal with, you can tell the difference by the crack thump of the round, if that round is close to you or far away from you. If is it effective or is it ineffective? You can tell by the rounds coming in if they're going to be landing near you or far away from you, and you become nonplussed about it. But when the rounds are coming in and they're landing around you, and it becomes very intense, then you become very aware of your surroundings and what you have to do, and you learn very quickly how to move between the shells coming down, and you find yourself, you do your drills, you hit the ground when the shells land, and when that lifts, you get up and you move to another location, because they would correct their fire onto where you were, so you don't want to be there. And while they're doing that correction and firing those rounds again, you've got yourself 30 seconds to a minute or so to get yourself to another location, preferably a little bit safer, and not be hit by the shrapnel.
Just before we got to the end of the village, the CO got up by the side to observe, and we saw that the most advanced Huns were about 250 yards from the point we were making for.
Reaching the outskirts of the village, Forbes Robertson gave his men a chance to catch their breath, as he, looking for a good vantage point to assess the situation, climbed up to look through a hole in a wall of a shelled-out house. From here he saw the enemy entering the Newfoundlander jumping-off trench. It was then he saw what appeared to be a hedge about 100 yards away.
Keegan! Keegan, that hedgerow is the only thing that stands between the Germans and the village. Good place to pick a fight, no?
Yes, sir. As soon as we got into the open, he let us have it with machine gun and rifle fire. We had 4 men killed, 2 wounded.
As they go from the edge of town where the artillery is, they've got to run through the German machine gun fire. So as they approach the town, they get out to this hedge, which turns out to be a trench. They're decimated by machine gun and rifle fire from the Germans. So out of that group that left headquarters, that made it through the artillery barrage, 10 of them make it to the hedge or the trench.
10 people, plus the support from the handful of the Essex that were left on the flanks who gave pause to that German advance. But what allowed that action to happen was the bravery of those men in A, B, C, and D companies who were already out there and stuck in those shell holes and literally fighting for their lives. And they kept fighting until they were out of ammunition. You're looking and there's large numbers of the enemy on 3 sides of you closing in on you. What are you going to do? Well, the smart thing to do would be to live and put your arms down and put your hands up. They didn't do that. They kept fighting. And because they did that, they bought that time for him to be able to move forward, to get himself positioned. Because by the time he got up there, they were advancing. Had they not done that, by the time he went forward, he would have met the first elements entering Monchy, and they would have known at that point that there was nobody in Monchy. Yeah.
The initial getting there, you look at it from a pure tactical perspective. The initial engagement, we're here, and we're going to make noise. We're going to engage. We're going to have rapid fire, which makes the enemy stop. They go, okay, we're not going to walk through this.
I can tell you, we did that 100 yards in record time and reached the bit of trench when he was about 180 yards away. There were only 9 of us then. The CO, Sergeant Waterfield, Corporal W. Pitcher, Corporal Parsons, Dolly he used to be called, a chap named Rose, Hounsel, a signaller, young Curran, you know him from up on Theatre Hill, a man called 10778 Parsons of the Essex, who followed us through the village, and myself.
When they had reached this so-called hedge trench, their numbers now down to 9, including the colonel, the situation only got more dire. For directly to the front of the hedge was the assembly trench, now filling with Germans.
Save your ammunition! Just shoot the scouts and runners! None of us are in the position! Come on, I tell you!
Lieutenant Colonel Forbes Robertson and his men immediately opened up on the Germans with rapid fire, thus making the Germans believe they were facing a much larger force. Every British soldier was trained to utilize his Lee Enfield rifle efficiently. When necessary, he was required to get off 15 rounds a minute and hit his target. Considering the Lee Enfield was a bolt action with a magazine capable of holding 10 rounds, it was not an easy task. This was further made more difficult by the fact that in training, the targets were often stationary. The battlefield was a totally different situation.
Well, then the fun began. It was a lovely day, just right shooting weather, and we dropped them like rabbits, soon stopping the loading fellows. Of course, nobody ever thought for a moment we could possibly last much longer than a quarter of an hour. but all the boys made up their mind that it was going to be some quarter of an hour. The CO was great, cracking jokes, controlling fire, and dropping his share of the Bosch. Personally, I never enjoyed anything so much.
The term sniper comes from the ability to shoot a very, very tiny bird known as a snipe, a small little shorebird. And if you could hit that bird, then you were referred to as a sniper. So this got carried over into the military, and those people who were the best shots eventually went on to become what was referred to as snipers.
The rapid fire of those 9 men did the trick of keeping the larger German force in the trench. Every bullet fired by the defenders was made to count. With the need to economize their ammunition, most of the fighting was done at close range. In the first 2 hours they had picked off 40 Germans, most of them scouts that were sent forward to ascertain the strength of the force opposing them. This did the job of keeping the enemy in the dark, that only 9 men were holding them at bay.
Some were better marksmen than others. Forbes Robertson, from all reports, was a splendid marksman. And Pitcher, I believe, another one who had a crack shot at, a running target at 300 or 400 meters.
Hitting a moving target at 200, 300, 400 yards becomes extremely challenging. The farther away they are, the harder it becomes. Yeah. Now, as the day progressed, they probably would have gotten a little bit better because the lines of communication would have roughly remained the same. So when they say run down to the woods, the guy would have taken the same route to run to the woods. They would have known where he was coming. And as they see a guy passing a point, they would have known I need to shoot at this point so that when this guy runs, he'll be hitting the same point that my bullet arrives, right?
Difficult, very difficult to do. So, they would have had that going on. It would have been business.
It really was not brilliant shooting to begin with. The Bosch at about 150 yards was easy. But after a while, some of them began to hesitate, and we had a chance of longer distances, shooting about 400. We kept on dropping them here and there for some time. Oh, the men were something marvelous. We got a competition going as our ammunition was scarce. Each of us shooting in turn, and no man fired till he thought he was sure of his target. Pitcher did some excellent work. I saw him drop a running Bosch at 400, which was a pretty good effort. The shot of my own I was most pleased with was an officer in a dugout at about 400. I dropped him on the steps.
To the right of the headquarters party, the sound of small arms fire could be heard. The Germans had tried to enter the village from the south, but were met by the 4th Worcester Regiment, who called down an effective barrage, and with their own rifle and machine gun fire pushed them back before they could reach the village outskirts. It was at this point that the 9 men in the hedge trench were reinforced, so to speak.
Hey, welcome to the party, boys. Start shooting.
The shell that everyone thought had killed him had only knocked out Corporal Hillier. And with him there the stage was set, and this band of 10 men were all that stood between the Germans and the village of Monchy.
So because what Forbes Robertson did and how he controlled the fire, the Germans weren't able to determine how many people were there. Had they have known there was only 10, they would have rushed forward and overran them.
But they were so fast and furious that the only explanation is that the Germans underestimated the number that were there and the firepower that they had.
The Germans had no idea. And had they have known, they would have rushed forward and they would have taken Monchy, and it would have been tens of thousands of lives to take that town back.
Had it fallen, not only would a strategic point have fallen into enemy hands, but the ground gained at the Canadian victory at Vimy Ridge would have been negated as well. Lieutenant Colonel Forbes Robertson knew that although they were doing a good job of holding the Germans at bay, his small band could not do it forever. They were running out of ammo and in dire need of reinforcements. The only way to get a message back to regimental HQ was by runner.
He talked about that it was a defining moment. He didn't use those words with me as a 10-year-old, but in that the CO had actually commented to him, when I read the history and I understand it a bit better now, that in the firing line when the 9 of them were there, he was next to Forbes Robertson on his left, and I remember the comment that he had something along the lines that Forbes Robertson had spoken to him and said, we've been through a lot together. Don't know if we're going to make it through this.
Well, we kept on for about 2 hours, and we were hurting him a bit, but we could not have prevented him from rushing the place, as there was hundreds and hundreds of him at 500 or 600 yards, but he never pushed, probably imagining that there was lots of troops. It was now about 1 o'clock. Oh, we hadn't had anything to eat since 6 a.m. We were starved, sure. But Corporal Parsons discovered a pack with iron rations in it. Rose found a tin with old bacon fat, so we lunched. And when the CO unearthed half a tin of marmalade, we thought we were at the Savoy.
As the Germans were forming up or moving into positions of cover, Forbes Robertson actually put all this information on his map, took the names of everybody there and wrote on his map of the names there in case they didn't make it out. And he sends Rose back with this map to tell people what's going on. As the battle went on, the British artillery started hitting all these spots that Forbes Robertson had identified where there was large concentrations of Germans. So they knew that Rose had gotten back and passed the message.
Incredibly, after delivering the message to battalion headquarters, Rose returned to the hedge trench and rejoined the fight. It was now early evening, and soon reinforcements were to arrive in the village to shore up the lines. The Germans had given up on taking the village of Monchy, believing they had come up against, as one general put it, a superior force. But these brave Newfoundlanders and one man from the 1st Essex had not just held the line, they had saved it.
I can imagine he felt a lot of things. He felt relieved that they had pulled this off, relief that they were alive, and that they'd done the job, sadness for those that they'd lost. If you look at the numbers when they talk about the signals group alone being over 30, there may have been, half a dozen, 8 of them in the battalion headquarters, and there were 3 of them that were left at the end of that day. So, they would have been reflecting upon that. You see in Keegan's letter, he talks about all his friends, all the lieutenants, and who they'd lost at Monchy, and the NCOs and the soldiers did the same. They just didn't write home and talk about it, but they had those, quiet reflections.
After collecting another 24 men who had straggled in from the battle, the remnants of the regiment moved back to Ronville, where they met up with the 10% reserve and counted its losses. And they were staggering. Total casualties for the regiment, 460. 166 were killed or died of their wounds. 141 were wounded. The regiment suffered the capture of the most POWs at any one time during the entire war. So it was on April the 14th, 1917, 10 resolute men were all that stood between the Germans and Monchy. They effectively saved the British line and previous gains, such as the Canadian victory at Vimy Ridge, and most importantly, the lives of countless other men that it would have taken to recapture all that would have been lost. The war, however, was not over for these brave men. Corporal Albert Rose, awarded the military medal, was to survive the killing fields of France and Belgium, and returned home to Flowers Cove. Promoted to sergeant and awarded the military medal, Walter Pitcher was killed 7 months later in the fighting at Magny. Lieutenant Kevin Keegan survived the war, and for his part in the defence of Monchy was awarded the Military Cross. Charlie Parsons received the military medal and was promoted to sergeant. He too survived the war and returned home to St. John's at the conflict's end.
At the end of the war, my grandfather ended up in the UK until he didn't come back to Newfoundland until 1919, in the fall of 1919, almost a year after the end of the war. Some of that he had taken leave. He had decided to stay in the UK and traveled and took in a lot of the country. He'd met my grandmother. So she came here in the early 20s and started a family.
Sergeant J.R. Waterfield was not as lucky. He was killed on October 17, 1917, near Cambrai. For his part of the defence of Monchy, he was awarded the military medal. Private Fred Curran and Orderly Room Corporal John Hillier made it through the big scrape and returned to St. John's after the war's end. Private Japheth Hounsell would not see his beautiful Wesleyville again. He was struck down in April of 1918, just 7 months shy of the war's end. Hounsell was also awarded the Military Medal for his role at Monchy. Lieutenant Colonel Forbes Robertson, who rallied his men against overwhelming odds to save Monchy-le-Preux and hold the line, was awarded the DSO and later went on to win the Victoria Cross while serving with the Border Regiment at the Battle of Esther.
But now when you become part of the regiment and you're a living part of that history of the regiment, and you fully comprehend how far back in time that this goes. This goes back to 1812. Even in 1795 in the regiment's founding, even before that, when soldiers from Newfoundland were, critical to the defense of Quebec City during the American Revolution. Our tie to, as you say, as a Canadian, you're proud of what they've done. Well, this has been, a pattern through history, and to fully comprehend that and see what, your own relatives have done as part of that history, and to be able to be there to carry on that tradition and to explain that to people is a great source of pride, absolutely.
Now, some 96 years later, sitting atop the old German strongpoint, the majestic Caribou Monument faces out towards a long, silent battlefield.
We knew what had happened. Poor old Dum, Rousseau, Stevenson, and all the others of our best and bravest were gone.
About 10 o'clock, Rose came along with the relief, and we went up to the dugout where the CO met us. A good feed, an hour or two's sleep, and we marched back to billets where the reserves were. It was really only then, in a way, that I realized the awful things that had happened, and all we had lost. There was not any Dum to jaw things over with. Rousel and Stevenson were gone, our babies, Clouston and Grace. Splendid, brave little chaps, and all the others. My God, the loneliness without them all. They could not do anything but brave work. They were all such bricks, so splendidly brave. I will never be able to tell anybody how awful it all was, and how thankful I was for that day's work against the Huns. I felt as though I had paid him back just a tiny little bit for all those dear old chaps.